Today, we are taking a fascinating, honestly kind of darkly comedic look at a side of history that, well, usually gets scrubbed from the polite chapters of your textbooks. We're talking about the bizarre, the chaotic, and the sometimes completely unhinged ways that history's most brutal dictators actually met their ends. So let's dive into that one unspoken history class question. Because we all know how these tyrants lived, right? Surrounded by absolute power, massive armies, terrifying personality cults. But how did they actually check out? I mean, when the walls finally closed in, did they face the music with any sort of dignity? Did they go out with a dramatic bang, a quiet whimper, or something absolutely bonkers? Well, spoiler alert, the answer is a resounding yes to all of the above. As we're going to see today, historical justice is rarely poetic, it is almost never neat, and it's usually completely chaotic. These are the surprisingly wild ways history's worst people finally left the building. All right, starting things off with Section 1, the cowardly DIY exits. Adolf Hitler's bunker finale. Okay, picture this. It's April 1945. The guy who literally dreamed of a 1,000-year empire is essentially trapped like a panicked rat in a concrete basement beneath Berlin. Soviet tanks are rolling through the streets right above his head. And just look at his completely unhinged final bucket list. A midnight underground wedding while artillery literally shakes the walls, check. A double suicide complete with one-person overkill by taking a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in the head at the exact same time, check. And then having your terrified loyalists drag your bodies upstairs to set them on fire in the garden while Soviet bombs explode, check. He entirely skipped the whole facing justice thing just to go out on his own bizarre terms. Moving right along to Section 2, brutal public mob justice. The wrath of the people. So, while Hitler managed to script his own cowardly exit, others faced a completely undignified reality check. These guys had massive egos, man. You had Benito Mussolini strutting around promising a literal new Roman Empire, and Muammar Gaddafi ruling Libya from literal palaces for 42 years. But the reality? Well, reality comes at you fast. In April 1945, Mussolini gets absolutely busted at a checkpoint, hiding in a German military coat trying to sneak his way into Switzerland. And Gaddafi? After his convoy was blown up by NATO airstrikes in 2011, this supposedly invincible dictator is found hiding in a dirt drainage pipe. Yeah, that quote right there actually became an international headline for Gaddafi. He was dragged out of that sewer, manhandled by jubilant fighters, and ultimately shot. And his grand final resting place before getting tossed in an unmarked grave, he was put on public display in a commercial freezer in Misrata, like defrosted chicken. And Mussolini didn't fare any better. After being executed, his body was dumped in a public square in Milan, the exact same square where he had executed partisans just months earlier. The crowd kicked him, spat on him, and finally strung him and his mistress up by their feet from the roof of a gas station like human piñatas. The empires fell, and they fell super hard. Which brings us to Section 3, killed by their own systems. The system failures of Stalin and Kim Jong-il. Let's take North Korea's Kim Jong-il. For 17 years, the state propaganda machine built this guy up into an absolute demigod. They literally told citizens he could control the weather and didn't even need to use the bathroom. But in December 2011, the 69-year-old succumbed to a very human, very normal, massive heart attack while riding a train. It turns out supposed godlike powers are completely useless against basic human biology. So what exactly does a dictatorship do when their immortal god king drops dead on his morning commute? Well, they panic. The government didn't even tell anybody for 2 full days. And when they finally broke the news, they used this bizarre, frankly hilarious euphemism, claiming he had a heart attack during a field guidance tour. I mean, it's just the wildest way to cover up that your all-powerful leader died on a train ride. Which perfectly segues into this number right here, 12. That is the exact number of hours Joseph Stalin's terrified guards waited outside his bedroom door in March 1953 before they even dared to check on him. He had gone to bed at 4 a.m. after a party, and when mid-morning came and went with zero sound, his staff knew something was horribly wrong. But they waited for 12 agonizing hours. And the reason they waited perfectly sums up Stalin's entire regime. He was literally killed by the fear he created. For 30 years, Stalin's go-to management style was surprise executions. He created such a suffocating climate of terror that his own guards figured, hey, if we open that door without permission and he's fine, he'll kill us. So they just let him lay there. When they finally worked up the nerve to peek in, the 74-year-old was lying in a puddle of his own urine, completely paralyzed by a massive stroke. Those delayed 12 hours meant permanent, fatal damage. He died a few days later, essentially a victim of his own terrifying success. All right, Section 4, Broadcast Trials and Executions, Modern Spectacles. As we move closer to the modern era, the grand downfall of a dictator meets the absolute unhinged chaos of live television. Take Nicolae Ceausescu. This guy ruled Romania like an absolute maniac for 24 years, but his downfall happened in a flash. In December 1989, a massive popular uprising collapses his government. He tries to flee, gets arrested, and then, on Christmas Day of all days, he and his wife are rushed through a trial, arrested, tried in 3 hours, and sentenced to death. All of it completely compressed into a frantic 72-hour window. And the execution itself took minutes. They were marched outside to a courtyard wall. There were no final statements, no dignity whatsoever. The firing squad showed absolutely no mercy, dropping them instantly with over 100 bullets. But here is the craziest part. They filmed it. That evening, Romanian television broadcast the bloody execution to a totally shocked global audience. You could literally sit in your living room on Christmas and watch a 24-year dictatorship end against a brick wall. Now, Saddam Hussein's exit was equally televised, but it was way more chaotic. The official plan for December 2006 was a formal, solemn, serious military hanging in Baghdad. The reality? Someone smuggles a flip phone into the execution chamber. While Saddam is standing there with a literal rope around his neck, guards start openly taunting him and shouting insults. Within hours, that grainy cell phone footage is leaked to the internet. A dictator's official execution instantly devolved into an early viral internet video. Just wild. And finally, Section 5, the infuriatingly peaceful escapes. Escaping justice. Because, as much as we might look at Mussolini or Ceausescu and think, okay, justice was served, the deeply frustrating reality is that some of the absolute worst escapists managed to avoid the mob and the gallows entirely. Take Pol Pot, the architect of the Cambodian genocide. 2 million people dead, that is the sheer amount of blood on his hands, and his punishment, a completely convenient death. After fleeing into the jungle and hiding out as a fugitive for 2 decades, he was finally put under house arrest in 1998. The remaining Khmer Rouge leaders had actually agreed to hand him over for an international war crimes trial, and then, wouldn't you know it, just days before he was supposed to face justice, he suddenly dies of heart failure in his sleep. So the butcher of Cambodia completely escapes accountability. But knowing the world would be incredibly suspicious of this extremely convenient timing, his followers pulled a bizarre PR stunt. They literally propped up his dead body and invited journalists to come take pictures, just to prove he was actually dead. Once the photos hit the global newspapers, they gave him the most pathetic send-off imaginable, cremating his body on a literal pile of old tires and garbage. I mean, a trash fire for a tyrant? Sure, but a tyrant who never had to see the inside of a courtroom. But perhaps the most enraging escape of all belongs to Augusto Pinochet, who seized power in Chile in 1973 and oversaw the torture and disappearance of thousands. He didn't die violently. He didn't hide in a bunker or a drainage pipe. He spent his final years comfortably fighting extradition by having his lawyers claim he was simply too sick to stand trial. In December 2006, he suffered a massive heart attack and died a week later in a comfortable military hospital bed. He was 91 years old, completely surrounded by his family. When you stack it all up side by side, the contrast is absolutely maddening. Mussolini ends up as an upside-down gas station piñata. Gaddafi is put on display in a commercial freezer like pieces of meat. But Pinochet, the man who tortured thousands, gets a private family funeral and his ashes scattered in the ocean. The absolute worst of the bunch got the most comfortable death without spending a single day in a prison cell. And honestly, that's the dark reality of history. It's chaotic, historical justice is rarely poetic, and it almost never works the way you'd expect, or, honestly, the way the victims deserve. Some dictators go down in flames, some face the pure, unadulterated wrath of the mob, and some just slip away quietly in the night. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on. When we look at guys like Pinochet avoiding trial through legal loopholes versus the totally brutal, visceral lens of Mussolini or Gaddafi, does true justice for a dictator actually require a little bit of chaos? Or do our rigid legal frameworks sometimes just allow tyrants to die comfortably in their beds? It is a dark question for sure, but understanding how history really plays out is the only way we learn from it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this provided you with a clear, if not totally wild, new perspective on the messy end of empires. See you next time.